Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Robert Conley, Nick Seidler, and Adam Balderstone for another episode of RPG Lab. We're going to be talking about world building today. Obviously it's a very central component of RPGs, and I think we all have pretty long experience with it. So we're going to just keep this conversation fairly casual, but we also have some practical things that we want to talk about as well, related to things that have happened at our table. So I don't know who wants to start. Just maybe offering up an explanation of what you consider world building to be, and then we can go from there.
I think I got one. Basically, for me, the point of why I do this is to play a campaign, and every campaign has a setting. You know, whether it's the Barsoom of John Carter, Middle Earth, or your own original creation, like Gygax did with Greyhawk, and Dave Aronson did with Blackmore, and or some people, kick bash a couple things, like I did with my own Majestic Waterlands, which is a combination of Judges Guild, Waterlands of High Fantasy, and my own ideas. But every campaign needs a place where their characters live. So there's a setting. Doesn't have to be in a great amount of detail, but if you're interested in that, sometimes it is. But but for many people, it's a daunting task because the setting literally can be an entire planet with billions of people all living their imaginary lives, and so it can be a pretty tough place to start. Figure out, where do I need to start?
And so, what do you think is a good place to start? Where would you?
Well, what you want to do is you should have the players generate, get an idea of what characters they want to play, and then just focus on the details that are local to them, and any high-level detail that they need to know. For example, if you're playing a bunch of superheroes and you decided, hey, I am going to play a bunch of superheroes in, say, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Well, your world building is they need to know, say it's like you decided this is a United States where superheroes have been around for a while. So not exactly like our own United States. So the first thing you got to do is give that, just about a paragraph worth of information, tell them the history of the United States, where, focusing on where it's different, i.e. the fact that they're a superhero. Did they come up during the World War II? Did they first emerge during the Atomic Age, or was it slightly later? And then, spend about a paragraph on that, and then spend a paragraph on how they affect, Pennsylvania in the local Harrisburg region, and then maybe another paragraph on what Harrisburg is like. And there you're going to do a lot of real world research about what's in Harrisburg and stuff. And then the last couple paragraph, 2 or 3, should be focused on who the players know, their neighborhood, what their jobs are, and stuff like that. And you're probably going to do it in 2 phases. You're going to give them the overview in the first part, in the first phase, all the way up down to this is Harrisburg, and then they're going to make their characters in a lot of detail. They're going to give you a rough sketch, and then they need the background to decide this is what my guy's actually going to be like. And then the next step, then after they make their characters, then you can give them all the details, like their sidekicks, their dependents, if you're going that route, who do they know, who's their contacts, and all the local particular detail. And by focusing, but the ultimate is your most amount of work is going to be in the player's immediate social circle and things they hear about, i.e. the things in Harrisburg, not in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Los Angeles. That, unless it's a very important event, say like Los Angeles gets wiped by a meteor strike, and that's when superheroes start appearing, that would be a sentence or 2 in your background.
Yeah.
But that way you don't have to be overwhelmed by creating an entire world at once.
Yeah, and you had mentioned research in there. I know that was because it was a real world example, but even in fantasy worlds, there's research, obviously, sometimes. So, how much research do you guys generally find yourselves doing when you're world building?
I'll chime in really quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
This is Nick. And so, like, there are different levels of research that you might do in world building. And so I play a lot of science fiction games. So when I try to do some research, and in science fiction games, you're landing on alternate planets, right? So you have the advantage of science, right, to help you out. And so if we're landing on different planets, I like to go to, like, the NASA website, or I like to go to, before the podcast started, we were having a conversation about how sometimes we use Wikipedia or other resources to go online and find out information. If we're setting something in a location that actually exists, doing research ahead of time is a very easy thing to do, thank you to the internet, where we can go and find out what things exist in a given town if we're dealing with a real city that exists. But even if we're completely making something up, or if we're setting something in a fantasy setting, we're fortunate enough to have resources that we can look up some things. So even if you know nothing about what, medieval culture would have been like, you can go online and find out, like, oh, what are maybe the 10 occupations that most people had during the Middle Ages? And then you realize that if you're going to fill your city with that, you better have a blacksmith, you better have a bunch of farmers, you better have someone who does medicinal things, even if that wasn't complicated like we would consider a doctor now. You'd probably have a teacher and all those different kind of roles. So I myself actually spend, I would say, a moderate amount of time doing some research. I don't think that anybody should ever get bogged down with 100% reality unless that is very important to your plot. But I think you should kind of make sure that you have kind of an okay feel and an understanding of what's real. Clearly, if your plot requires something to be exactly correct, you're setting your story in medieval Jerusalem during the Crusades, and just because of the setting, you don't want to get anything right, or maybe there's some cultural reasons you want to make sure that you're accurate about the things, then I might do more research. But other than that, I keep it pretty vague, but decently researched. How do you guys feel?
With research on my end, I like research from the standpoint that my biggest barrier to world building or even adventure creation is just I hate having the blank page. It's like the best way to get past that is to get information. Once you start finding information, stuff just kind of flows. It's like whether it's research. I mean, because research, it can be real world research, but you can also get a lot of research out of just reading, fantasy books, science fiction books, or even gaming books. Even it's like you just kind of. I like to gather as much information as I can when I'm putting a campaign together, and I grab lots and bits of every time I see a piece that I like, I add that to my notes, and the world kind of comes together out of the pieces I take from all these different sources.
Yeah, the thing that I would caution people about, using real world sources for research is that they're frustrating incomplete.
Yes, yes,
yes.
Because there are very few non-gaming books that have the good stuff, because they're written with an entirely different purpose than having some poor game master who doesn't have a whole lot of time on their hands to find that one nugget information. But literally, I have read 200-page books and found there was just one key sentence, and that was the key sentence I was looking for to back up my historical. So, which is why I recommend that if you are pressed for time and you want some historical I can't pronounce it. Verisimilitude? Is that
verisimilitude?
Right.
I think is the
verisimilitude. If you want that, there are several very good gaming, resources. For example, there's the Harn book. There is Fife and another book called Town by an author named Lisa Steele. And so they are people who have done the research for you, and they have a much, I guess, for lack of a better term, hit rate than actually diving into historical research. But there are some really, really good books.
It's a big challenge. It's definitely a big challenge because, like you said, the history books, they're usually written because somebody's examining a whole different set of questions than a game master is going to have. We're wondering, what does the door look like at the inn, and who's the boss of the town, and who does he answer to? And we have like very ground level specific answers that we need. And a lot of times the historians don't have to answer every one of those details. They're looking at other things, or they're looking at a list of like a ship manifest or something to find out about the trade in in a given region. And so but one thing you can do is you can build to those things. You can rather than end up, because you can end up in the situation when you read a 200-page book for the one question that you have, and that can be incredibly frustrating. And so what I've learned to do is I've learned to go to the book and make sure that all that other information that I wasn't looking for somehow becomes relevant to what I'm doing. So that,
sure.
But go on. It looks like you have an example.
So the other book one recent book I read that I recommend is called History of the Ancient World, and it's part of a series. So there's a history of medieval world, and it's by Susan Bauer. And she does a very good job of outlining history and make it more people-oriented than usual, because she has a knack of, like, for example, she talks about the legend of Gilgamesh and, how much of it is really historical and stuff like that. But she draws in other sources to really paint Gilgamesh as like he doesn't spend a whole lot because, like I said, there's not much source material. There's like 6 chapters in the legend. The Gilgamesh legend is a 6-chapter book, basically. And but she used what's known about other Sumerian kings and stuff to paint him as if he was going to be a real king, and she shows you how in parallel what's happening in China and stuff. And it's a really good book if you're interested in getting a broad overview of history and what was happening when.
Another thing I would recommend if you want that broad overview is like historical atlases of the world, where you can see, like, okay, this is the globe and here's all the stuff that was happening in this date. Historical atlases are really a valuable tool that you can find traces of them online, but there's nothing quite like going and getting a full historical atlas.
Oh, yeah.
I'm actually going to shift gears for 1 second, if it's okay with you guys.
Of course.
And that is that, I know we're talking about research and going in really deep into some details when it comes to like our world building. I'll say this: I don't think one always needs to go very detailed, and I'd like to just give some examples of that for a second. So, and again, I'm thinking sci-fi right now a little bit more than I am like fantasy gaming, but I kind of think that there are like 4 things that a person can quickly look at, in my opinion, when you're building a world that can change the viewpoint of the experience that people have. And in the sci-fi game, I think you can look at either a planet, a country, a city, or a culture, and make one change to how we're used to those things to create something brand new. So I jokingly say you land on a planet. This planet has a methane atmosphere. That now means that everyone on the planet needs to wear spacesuits, and you're only safe to breathe when you're inside a building or in a spacesuit. So that would be one example. If you're in a country, right, and we live in America, or at least I do, if you end up in a place where no one has freedom of speech, or maybe women are not allowed to walk around in public, but now your party has a woman in the group, and so now everyone's reacting to that in a very different way. So I would say that's a country level thing. And then city, I joke about this, but where are things in your city, right? Is the city hall the center of town, which is pretty typical where we are, but maybe it's the library, or maybe it's the funeral parlor / Soylent Green plant that is at the center of the city, right? So that changes things a little bit. And then I also say, like, culture is one of those things that can change an atmosphere where you can world build with one simple change from where we have. And that might be, what if you land or if you are adventuring in a place where colors are not boldly displayed, right? So your group of adventurers comes into town and they have red and blue and green on, and everyone else is wearing gray, and suddenly they're attracting attention in a different way, right? And so sometimes when we're talking about world building, we don't have to do a ton of research, all of which is valid, but sometimes making a change to the world that they're in, a very simple change, affects everything that happens in the rest of the game. What do you guys think about that?
I think you want to definitely leave room for imagination and that kind of thought experimenting to go on. And I also think research is a very subjective thing. Like Rob and you and Adam and I might all have different bars that we're going to set for what we're striving for with our campaigns. And so it's really, when you're doing the research, it's about whatever level you're trying to hit with that. But I think with again, the imagination element of it, when I did my fantasy setting, I specifically thought in terms of two things. I was thinking in terms of the history, the kind of historical stuff I wanted, but I was also thinking about Star Trek and and shows like that and books like that, like Ringworld, where it's all kind of a thought experiment, like you were just saying, or what if this one thing were different, or what if all the people, and it's fantasy, so you can add in other sorts of things. What if there's a giant head that lives in the pond, and it, and when the head's upset, people don't get water, and when it's happy, they get, like what does that do to the local culture? That's the kind of stuff that I enjoy when I read science fiction or fantasy. So I always try to bring those things to the table, and I think you can really, I consider it like the Star Trek approach, where you take the culture and you change the thing, and then and you see it in Doctor Who too, and it's really it's a really quick way to come up with an interesting culture, and it also is fun. I find it enjoyable as a game master to do that.
I think another thing too is that once players understand the genre or the kind of setting you're going for, there's a lot of work you don't need to do. Like, when we're playing Ogre Gate, that's Wuxia. And if you say, okay, you guys go into an inn, it's like, I have a different picture in my mind. If you're playing in Greyhawk, it's like, you don't need to sit there and explain to me the difference between this, old Chinese inn and the European style in Greyhawk. My brain does all of that. The game master, just by setting the genre, a lot of work is done for the game master.
Yeah, I've given this advice before in my blog, is that you should harness the power of stereotype in our common cultural heritage. Now, most people's view of the Middle Ages isn't accurate, but if you're talking about a campaign in Greyhawk or another made-up fantasy world that's vaguely medieval, you can play up on the merry old England, stereotype that people have Middle Earth, and do what Nick said, change one or two things to make it your setting. But that has two advantages: less work for you, and it makes, if the players see you playing into the stereotype, then they can say, yeah, in merry old England, this is what we can do and not do, and that part of their uncertainty in that regard goes away. I don't know how you guys felt playing my game, but it seems like once you picked up on the fact how medieval my setting was, you were pretty much I see you were using your knowledge of medieval history to generate opportunities for role-playing and stuff. And the other comment I want to make is, when you have to choose between doing stuff, the only thing that ever matters in any of this research, any of these world building stuff, does it impact the behavior of an NPC that the players will interact with, whether it's a sentient being or a monster.
Yep.
But it only matters if the player interacts with it. Now, if you enjoy making historical maps, by all means, make your historical map. But just realize you're just doing that for yourself, okay? It may inspire you to later, but ultimately it all has to tie back to you getting out your funny voice or your different mannerism or however you role play. But it all has to tie back to you role playing an NPC or a monster in a specific situation, or it doesn't have any meaning. The players will never see it otherwise.
That's something that was in my notes. I'm like, I agree completely. It's so important.
I have tourism down. Like, you can end up in the tourism situation where players come and they see the interesting thing, but there's not necessarily anything for them to it's just there. It's not, or like Rob was saying, they don't even know about it. It's over the hill. And so I think there's a couple of things. Some of the stuff you make when you world build is not going to come up during the game just by accident, because the players didn't walk through the door, so they never saw the room, or they never saw they never went to that village. But what you want is something that if it does come up, that it's usable, that it's So I usually try to think, like, one of the questions I'll sometimes ask myself is there an adventure hook present in this description of this place that I have, or is there nothing there for them to, like, is there any way for me to use this material when the party gets there, or am I just giving them an interesting description of a tree? Do you know what I mean? And so I think it depends on how you think of hooks. I tend to think of them kind of like Rob, where it's a lot mainly through the NPCs, where I have an NPC who wants something or is in a situation, and if the players connect with that, there's going to be something enjoyable that arises from it, or at least the NPC.
Now,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Sometimes history can impact if history does impact NPC behavior, then it is useful work. If Faloria and Gilder hate each other because of past war, and because Gilder took some of Faloria's territory, and now the inhabitants of the two lands hate each other, that impacts the behavior of NPCs. So that is a historical detail that will get used someday in your campaign.
No, and those kind of conflicts are very, very usable. They're very easy to sort of deploy in a on the fly situation if you have that background. But I don't know. Yeah, I think I think that you definitely do want to think in terms of the function of all of these things. Go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was going to say, it's also interesting. I really like what Rob is saying about how whatever world building you're doing, or what cultural things that you're putting into place, are reflected by the non-player characters and how they act in certain situations. And I'll go one step farther to that, to even a conversation that we had a little bit earlier, which was that doesn't mean that everybody has the same opinion. So even within that culture, you will find people who are part of different sects or different political groups or different groups of people who have different viewpoints on things. And I think that can sometimes be played into a non-player character situation where you encounter someone and they have one certain viewpoint. You're like, oh, okay, cool. This is how the people here act. And then you find yourself in a different situation with a different sector group of people. That's something that can be played into a good world, or a complex world, if they're going to be somewhere for a while, to realize that not everybody is maybe mad about the invasion from Gilder. Maybe there were some people who were supporting that were in that area, So I'm just saying there's some interesting things that can be done with all of that.
Yeah, and the thing, it doesn't have to be very complex, too. So you establish a baseline for how the NPCs acted, say, in the Kingdom of Gilder, regardless of how it's just... You decide, what do people of Gilder like? So you define your baseline and just pick 2 or 3, whatever you can keep in your head, sliders in your head, and then just twist those sliders when you need to come up with an actual NPC, and you'll be surprised how much variations you'll get out of just a handful of sliders.
And yeah, no. So the I know, and I think too, Rob. You always have this saying. I'm probably going to butcher it, but it's something like, eventually the players explore all the dungeons and they explore all the territory, and all that's left is the NPC. Like the NPC is ultimately the thing, and that is definitely true. Like you even in the most well maintained campaign setting where you're updating things regularly, eventually the NPCs always become the thing that you have to fall back on as, this is the whatever conflicts are going on or whatever things are motivating them. That's kind of what is gonna be the part of the chemical reaction for the players when they enter into the picture. Go ahead.
Yeah, our longest running forms of entertainment are invariably are like soap operas and stuff. Most of the soap operas for the past decades have been set in various suburban locations. Something very relatable, but people just watch them for years because they become invested in the characters and their interrelationships. Because fundamentally, we're wired to be most interested in other people. So when you look at a rule book, even if you take the thickest, Dungeon Crawl Classics or Hackmaster 5th edition rule book, you're eventually going to experience if you play it long enough, you'll experience everything that rule book has to offer. If you're in a setting and you play in enough campaigns, you'll see all the territories that you want to see in that setting. So what's left? The people. Because that's always going to change. If you keep track of the changes in your setting, and even if your campaign never ventures beyond the village of, Balderstone, the coin a name, but if it never varies from Balderstone, the people of the next campaign of Balderstone are going to be impacted what happened on the previous, so it's going to be different. And, and the players might go, yeah, well, how's it different? Oh, wow, this happened. And, they just get hooked. And I call that the soap opera effect. If you're able to engage the soap opera effect, you can keep a campaign going on for years, maybe even decades, a few rare instances.
I just thought of kind of a neat segue for that, and that was that my group just played, the soap opera campaign. My group just played a game on Friday, the day before the royal wedding, which took place at the royal wedding. So this is a Doctor Who game. They time traveled to the wedding of Harry and Meghan Markle, and a nefarious plot was going on behind the scenes. So the day before the wedding, they solved the plot to make sure that the wedding would go okay, and then, of course, the next day was the actual royal wedding, right? And so, in terms of world building, being able to use the existing world and the advantage of a time travel game, right, is that we knew exactly what was going to happen the next day, but there was flexibility for us to kind of change what was going on. And to me, I think that plays into a little bit of the comment that you were just making that kind of fits together like that. So,
sure.
No, and I think that, and I think also the change is the important part too that you were talking about, Rob, which is that people die, they have children, the players do things to them that make them mad or make them happy, and so it's the long game, the sort of it's that character over time and the investment people have in it that can make it interesting. If it's an NPC who's like a antagonistic to the party, it's the how that relationship plays out over time is kind of where a lot of the fun comes in, and you need to kind of keep track of what if the guy comes, if the character is introduced again after an absence, what's been going on in the intervening period, that sort of thing.
So Nick, I have a question.
I'm sorry, I was going to make that comment that returning characters are some of the funnest things that players respond to when they make friends or see someone or time passes. Recurring characters are a great part of world building. Go ahead, Rob. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Did they interact with Harry and Meghan? They did indirectly. I mean, they one or two short
things. Megan's father was not at the wedding. We knew that was going to be the case. So one of the characters actually like walked her from the car to the front of the church, at which time somebody else was going to like take her down the aisle. It turned out Prince Charles actually walked her down the aisle, and some unknown rando dude walked her like kind of like up the stairs. We're like, that was our guy. Like, okay. So
as far as reoccurring characters that are allied, that's a good point. I would recommend that you keep a little notepad and actually, it's altogether easy to make your NPCs antagonists to the players. Mm-hmm. So what I would do, if you feel that's a problem, is keep a little notepad and say, ally, antagonist, and put a little tick mark about how you role play each NPC. If the players are a jerk to the NPCs, of course the NPC is going to turn out to be an antagonist. But if they're not, it's a neutral encounter. Well, just keep it varied so that, because the players will get paranoid and stop interacting with NPCs if every NPC is antagonistic in some way.
That's where motivation is very important, where you're talking about knowing like what the characters want and all that. And if like I had a guy in the Ogre campaign who's Bronze Master Adam, who's always a villain. He's one of my big villains, but he wanted something that was somewhat in line with what the players wanted, and also him and one of the player characters, there was just chemistry between them in terms of the personalities, so they hit it off and they became friendly. I think that. You don't want to have every NPC be a villain. That's a really bad habit to get into. You want to make good villains when you make them, but like you want to make a guy who could become a good villain, but maybe be a friend as well. It doesn't have to be determined in advance what the relationship to the party is. All you need to know going in is this is what this person wants. And
I would recommend, so as far as to overplay the friendliness for like one or two.
Yeah. Like
maybe once every 2 or 3 sessions, make sure one NPC is overly friendly.
And helpful.
Helpful. They don't have to shower the player. Well, but they could be really helpful, if they did a player, your bard play a really good song, you can have the room for the night half off or something like that.
No, I think that's really important. That's you can if you went through life and everybody was mean to you and betrayed you, you'd be very cagey. And the same thing happens to player characters. Like they need a variety of different kinds of people. If everybody's trying to betray them, you're never going to have a moment in your campaign where there's an actual betrayal that's like a surprise. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I'll add to that, right? We're talking about world building, and so that is that in our real lives, right? We've made friends, or in some cases we've made enemies, and then over time, sometimes some of our best friends have drifted out of our lives, or we've had a dramatic situation in which maybe some of our best friends have actually become, I don't know if I want to use the word enemies, but maybe not so close friends.
Frenemies is the word you're looking for.
Ourselves. So to me, like the element of world building is also evolving some of those characters, and changing those relationships, and building can be a lot of things, right? So you can have a romantic relationship with an NPC, or you can get off on the wrong foot and hate each other for years, and all of a sudden that's the only person who's just in the town who's willing to fight at your side when something goes wrong and it's unexpected. So I think that element of world building, to me, means tracking some of those non-player characters, like Rob was suggesting, and then going farther than that and keeping a long-term track of them as well, right? And maybe evolving some of those relationships as, in real life, we move in and out of some of them.
I would even add, the most useful tool I developed for myself was a list of the living and the dead. Because I was amazed at how often I was forgetting that it died 12 sessions ago, died, or, and it became, maybe I just getting older, my memory got worse. So now I have an ongoing list of the dead that I can refer to.
And you have a lot of multiple campaigns going at once too, so I can see it being doubly confusing. It's like, is this guy alive in this continuum or not? But yeah, I think kind of expanding the idea of making friendly PCs just to connect people. It's like, I think overall that's part of, you want to have ways for players to connect with the world. You don't want them to be just, well, I mean, some campaign types you do, but you want to, basically you want to think, are they just tourists passing through this world, or do they have friendships, and do they have like organizations they belong to, or like a nation that they feel patriotism for, or something. You want to, anytime a player gives you any opportunity to connect something like that, you want to use it.
Well, that's where institutions and things like that can become very useful. We have a lot of institutions in the real world, and it's easy to overlook that when you're world building. And so to make sure that you have the institutions that the players will be able to be part of, or that they can, the NPCs can belong to, and that can become, not just like government, but like, things like societies or guilds or a variety of whatever, can add that sort of group element to the game. Because then you have, I think, Rob, you made this point earlier. If you have the power groups, then you can sort of extract all the individual characters that you need from those. Like if you have this nation that hates this nation, it's easy to sort of generate PCs. And by the same token, if you have these feuding societies or these trade guilds that are all trying to outmaneuver each other, you can just sort of build the characters out of that.
Well, yeah, and you got to remember, an organization or a country or any, let's call them cultures, they're always about, they're the sum of the individual members. So it's, again, if you have, say, like in my campaign, an order of Meridians, which is like a sort of like anti-paladins and stuff, they are an order in the shared ideal, but it's comprised of individuals. So Meridian Baker in all respects, although both of them are probably, you would consider pretty, hardcore, a bit on the tyrannical side, a bit on the might and right side, but they're variations in between those two sides. They're not cookie cutters of each other. So, that's, you just got to keep that in mind. If you're able to vary that, your relations will now become that much more interesting to the players.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's something where I think, Adam, you kind of made this point. The accumulation of information can kind of help you with that sort of thing. If you're having trouble coming up with those variations, you can always take a look on the internet or into variety of sources. What do you guys do for cosmology? Like, how do you? I know, Nick, you do Doctor Who a lot, so obviously you're sort of working with an existing cosmology, but that means you have to apply the principles of it to the to the campaign world, and that's, in Doctor Who, that's challenging. But do you do cosmology, Rob, before you start world building, or after, or as you're doing it?
It's one of my initial steps because it influenced how my world. If I were to make something from scratch, I would start with the cosmology would be one of the initial steps. Now, with the Majestic Waterlands, because it evolved, I did some backtracking and what's that term? Where they changed something in midstream.
Retcon.
Retcon. Yeah, I did a lot of retcons with the Majestic Waterlands. But once I did the retcon, everything, my cosmology to where it is now, that everything else flowed from that. But it's the best to have. I mean, there's two ways you could do it. You can start small and build up the surrounding world, or you can start big and just quickly narrow down to the area that you need. And but if I do the top-down approach, I start cosmology is early on.
Yeah, I think cosmology is so basic, you can't really. I mean, it shapes so many things about your world and the institutions within it and what people's goals are. It's like, if you've got a uncaring Lovecraftian world versus a law versus chaos world versus a good versus evil world. I mean, it's like those things shape so much of the feel of your world. If you haven't, it's hard to do a whole lot before you've decided any of that.
And I will add that, again, it all comes back to the NPCs. What you want to, it's nice, the problems with the old deities, demigods, and heroes, and later deities, and then the later deities and demigods, is that they focus on the gods as monster, where they should have been focused is on religion as culture, because the culture of the religion is what the players will see, because the culture influences the NPC's behavior, because an NPC who follows Maestra is going to act different morally than an NPC who follows Set, to give an example.
Though there is something to be said for playing gods as characters in the setting too. That can definitely have and if you like, you can play the cosmology the same way that you play other NPCs and groups and countries in your setting, if you're comfortable with it enough. I think it's something I often like to do, that where having a good handle on, and it kind of gets to what you're saying, Rob, what does this guy, what does Ramos think about X, Y, and Z, and when his followers do that, how is he going to react to them?
Well, my question would be, you can have campaigns where gods walk among us. Yeah, sure. I mean, oh man, I'm not doing good with names, but I know it's our Kevin Crawford published a rule book to support that kind of play, where the default character is a demigod and stuff like that. But then you have to ask the question: is what is the role of religion in a world where gods might walk among us?
Absolutely, no, that's very important, and that's where it gets interesting, I think. And when you have gods walking among the people, how can you explain having different sects that view them differently if they're really there? When I did it, I came up with an answer that worked for me. Everybody's going to probably answer that question differently, but but the point that I was trying to make is you can sort of do both. You can kind of you can have the religious angle, but if you have the gods that are active in the setting, knowing the god the same way that you know an NPC is really important.
Well, I'll take that even one step further. And the neat part about a fantasy role-playing game, or a science fiction role-playing game for that matter, is that one of the things that can happen in the world, even after you've figured out the cosmology and how everybody fits together, is you can have a shift take place that's unexpected, right? So there's an eclipse that happens, and while gods are walking among everyone, those demigods all lose their powers, and now they're mortal people. And maybe all the mortal people get powers or something. So there's an opportunity to shift the standard dynamic of what's going on. Adam was talking about how, you can set up, clearly a Lovecraftian game will feel different than a different world game, but you can also shift that. Nothing would be better than playing a Lovecraftian adventure in a super happy, Smurf Village setting, right, where everybody's happy and it's all positive. And guess what? Maybe Lovecraft is the good guy, or Cthulhu, I should say, not Lovecraft, but the great ones. There's a lot to be played with world building, with doing some shifts like that people might consider.
No, I like that kind of stuff. In fact, it's also good for origin stories of things in the setting. I had one where that's how magic came into the setting. Was one of the gods died and people absorbed the magical energy, and so there was a point in the history where there weren't any wizards, and then suddenly they appeared. So I think that can be, and if you do that mid-campaign, that could be, you got to be careful though. I remember they did something like that for Forgotten Realms in the '90s, and it kind of threw people.
It's tough. Yeah, I mean, when you're professionally world building, it's like they have to be careful because you're messing with a thousand other people's campaigns when you're doing that, and it's you can really upset people if you rock the boat too much.
Yeah, I like how Harn does it. They've been their present year is the year 720, and it's been 720 since 1981. So thank God for that.
I think when it comes to Metaplot, the problem with Metaplot is it becomes an excuse to sell books, and so you do the thing where you release 220-page books or box sets. I guess they don't do box sets anymore, but you release a lot of content that people have to read, and it becomes like a canon thing. Whereas if there is going to be Metaplot, the way that I would like to see it done is more optional, as like a 1-page yearly update or something, if you want to advance the timeline. But I agree with you. I think when you have a property like Harn that is just sort of, it has the same starting point, it's a lot easier to build off of as a GM. And also it's a lot easier for them to be consistent too, I would imagine. If they're using that as their baseline, they don't have to worry about, is this the stuff I was talking about? Is this NPC dead now, or is this nation even still a nation anymore?
Yeah, well, it's easy. It's easy. I mean, world building appeals to gamers, but there is actually an audience of people who like role playing books purely because they're really fascinated by world building, and it's easy for a game company to start catering to those people who just buy the books and are enjoying reading them, there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to be aware of who your audience is when you're writing this stuff, because what's good for one audience can be really bad for the other.
When Dungeons and Dragons was in its when D&D was in its second edition, and they were releasing a number of gazetteer books, I think that's exactly what was appealing to some people, Adam. Was just the idea that they could read different settings and different worlds that they could decide to apply as they felt good. So I believe there were a slew of those in the 90s.
There were. I think it was more complicated than that. I think it was because I was game. That was like my era as a GM. Like I think you guys are largely a earlier edition crowd, and
this is when I worked in a game store era for people. So
but I was the target audience, is what I'm saying, and so I think what was going on is you had a lot of people that were just reading those books, and then they would buy the game books and they would do that. But most of the people I knew were reading those books and playing the games. But I think what did end up happening was, either way, the profit motive is what was largely dictating it, and so there was a lot of cool stuff.
I'll say the one thing you're missing out on is that the 90s were when all the 80s kids, that 80s D&D boom kids, that's when they all moved away from high school and lost their gaming groups. Okay. And you had a lot of customers were people that just kind of. They still loved gaming, but they hadn't got their adult lives together in a state where they were gaming again. And so those books were candy to them.
But I do remember Ravenloft was the line I was familiar with, and I bought every book religiously when it came out, every box set. And the one thing I do remember is the original black box set. It was somewhat incomplete. It had its issues, but it always, to me, felt a lot more inspired and functional than a lot of the box sets that came after it, where they would update the setting. They even made improvements, like there were some geographic improvements they made because of the Grand Conjunction and all the, they had all these events and Metaplot stuff. But I think that all they really needed was that one initial box set, and then, the adventures. But I don't know. I think with again, when we're talking about it from a professional angle, then it becomes different, because obviously people are trying to make money, and and they're like you said, they're affecting 1,000 campaigns with every release, and that's a lot different than world building for just your group of 7 friends that you're playing with.
They're crazy.
I was going to say, I think that begs to remind everyone who's listening to this podcast what I would consider the most important part about world building, and that is that regardless of what you build in your world, be consistent with it. And even if another quote-unquote official book comes out, or there's another opportunity to do something, stick with what you have and what works for you and your campaign. right?
Yeah.
I think that the fear was in the 90s when, as those gazetteers came out, or expansion books and other things like that, that you were then expected to put that into your campaign, or sometimes your players would insist, well, a new book came out, now we have to add that. This is how this works. And I'll kind of go back to the whole, when a game master is world building, the environment that people are in and the world and the cities and the culture, stick with what works for your group. Stick with what works for your campaign. You're not, in my opinion, ever obligated to change anything because there's a new product or something like that. And I think experienced players get that, but I think sometimes other people will argue over that. And there's arguments at the game table sometimes over that. But that's where I think a game master needs to kind of stick their guns and go, no, this is the way it works for us.
Yeah, I always make it a rule whenever I run a. Oh, sorry, go ahead. But I make it a rule that whenever I'm running something that's published, that it is my setting. I'm taking inspiration from this setting. I might be using maps from it or NPCs or whatever, but it's what I'm doing. You can't counter me. Go, but in this novel, this thing happened. It's like, no, it didn't happen because it's not my game.
That's the worst. I mean, that really bothers me when you have that at the table as a player or as a GM. I'm sorry, Rob, you were going to say something.
Actually, Adam said it for me. If you use a published setting, gather the material that you want to gather and use that as your base. Explain to your player, this is what I'm using. Anything that comes, I am not using, unless I say otherwise, don't assume that's in play. And to go with what Nick's saying is, even in, tabletop role playing can be stated, pretty straightforward. We sit around the table, the players make characters, the dungeon master, the game master makes a setting, and you all pretend, you pretend to be in the setting doing interesting things, and I adjudicate what happens and tell you what happens. How we think about that when it comes to the actual application is very different, because we all think that's subtly different. Yeah. How you keep in your head the fact that a village is comprised of a half a dozen different styles of peasant houses. How you store that and remember it, whether you have a table by your side that you roll dice on, or actually that you can actually hold it in your head and pull it out when you need it, or you just keep a book. You're better off just reading it. Don't feel bad about any particular method. The only in here, learn all the techniques you can, then pick the one that works for you and that works for your group and that's interesting and fun to play. Because that's, in the end, we're doing a form of entertainment. So it has to be interesting and fun.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think that's a good place to end on. Does somebody have anything they want to add before we sign off?
I think Rob just hit it out of the park, actually.
Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, so we'll be back on again. We don't know what the topic is yet, but I'm sure it'll be something interesting and fun for all of us. And also, I did want to mention that we had a special the other day on Cobra Kai that me, Adam, Lady Chaofeng, and Kenny did. So people can check that out, and they can check out all the other normal shows that we have. And so, all right, we will let you go, and we'll talk to you later.